Chapter 31 Life in Pulau Bidong. The sea has spared her life, but Pulau Bidong received Chi Thanh Hoa with a harsh embrace. The island rose abruptly by the South China Sea, its steep green hills covered with tangled vegetation, its shores rimmed with narrow beaches where waves crashed endlessly. For those who reached it, the island was salvation, but salvation wrapped in hardship. Pulau Bidong had become one of the most crowded places on earth. By January 1979, there were 18,000 Vietnamese on the island, and by early 1979, it was said to be the most heavily populated place on earth, with about 40,000 refugees crowded into the flat area hardly larger than a football field. Tens of thousands of Vietnamese boat people had washed ashore there, each with the story of terror and survival, each with memories of homeland they had fled. Wooden shacks clung precariously to hillsides, tarpaulin roofs sagged under tropical rains, and footpaths turned to rivers of mud with every storm. Food were rationed, water carried in buckets, and disease stalked the crowded quarters. To survive here required endurance, not only of the body but of the soul. The loneliness. For Chi Thanh Hoa, the first weeks were a blur of exhaustion. She lay up for food, small portions of rice and dried fish. She fetched water in the plastic jug, waiting hours under the burning sun. She found a corner in a share hut, little more than a bamboo platform, where she could rest her head. At night, the sound of the waves mingled with the cries of the children, the coughs of the sick, the whispered prayer of the desperate. Yet what weighed most heavily was not hunger or heat, but loneliness. She was surrounded by people, yet felt utterly alone. Each face was a stranger's. Each family clung to its own sorrow, though they shared the same exile. There was little comfort in the crowd. She missed the parents, she missed the siblings, she missed the familiar street of home. Even under oppressions, even with fear, loneliness knocked her at her heart more sharply than hunger ever could. They passed into weeks. The Red Cross distributed supplies. UN officials came and went, recording names, registering families, explaining procedures in languages half understood. Rumors spread like fire. Australia was taking families. The US was opening doors. Canada wanted skilled workers. Each rumor ignited hope, then faded into uncertainty. The island was a waiting room, and waiting is the hardest labor of all. In her solitude, Chi Thanh Hoa often sat by the beach at dusk, watching the horizon glow red before night fell. The sea that had once threatened her now seemed strangely calm. But if keeping its secrets hidden beneath the waves, she would press her knees to her chest, listening to the chatter of others, and let her thoughts drift back to Saigon. She would almost hear her mother's voice, almost see father's weary but determined face, and she would wonder, will I ever see them again? Then a surprise. It was months later, in the heavy heat of mid-1979, when a miracle arrived. Another refugee boat approached Pulau Bidong, weather and weary, carrying yet another group of survivors. Boats came often, so at first there was nothing unusual. The people waiting on shore had grown used to the sight, thin figures stepping into sand, trembling legs touching land, and the first time after days at sea, some staggered, some wept, some simply collapsed. But among this group, one young woman clutched a bundle in her chest, a tiny baby boy, only a few months old. Beside her walked a man with tired eyes, his arm steadying her, and when the young woman lifted her face, the words fun of Chi Thanh Hoa. It was her sister Thanh Vân. The moment was unreal. Thanh Hoa blinked, disbelieving. For months she had survived in isolation, never imagined that another member of her family might appear on this forsaken island. Yet here was her sister, flesh and blood, holding a joy born into exile, stepping on to the same ground. She ran forward. Thanh Vân saw her, and in an instant distance vanished. They embraced fiercely, tears streaming down both their faces, their bodies trembling with shock and relief. Around them, other refugees looked on silently, some smiling, some weeping at the sight, for in that moment hope became visible. In the world of endless separation, here was reunion. The baby whimpered between them, pressed gently as the two sisters clung together. Quân stood nearby, his face solemn, his body worn by the ordeal of escape, but his eyes softened as he watched the two women cry in each other's arms. Sisters in exile, life in Pulau Bidong did not grow easier because of reunion. The camp was still crowded, food still scarce, sickness still rampant, but the loneliness lifted. To have a sister beside her changed everything for Chi Thanh Hoa. No longer did her face the long nights alone. No longer did she whisper prayers in solitude. They shared stories, comforted each other, and carried the baby between them, rocking him to sleep while the ocean wind rattled in the tin roofs. The sister would sit in the evening remembering their parents, their siblings, the house in Saigon that seemed a lifetime away. They spoke of their childhood, of laughter at once filled their days. They reminded each other that even in exile they were not abandoned. For little moments, Pulau Bidong became less of a prison but more of a part of the story of their lives. Telegrams across the world. Meanwhile, far away across the oceans, news traveled by fragile wires. A telegram reached the United States, where Sister Tam lived. It carried simple but powerful words. Chi Thanh Hoa had arrived safely in Pulau Bidong. For Tam, the message was both a relief and summons. Without hesitation, she began the paperwork to sponsor her sister in the United States with the promises of freedom and new beginnings, which soon opened its door to another member of the family. But not all paths led to the same place. Anh Quân and Chi Thanh Vân, holding their baby in their arms, made a different choice. They applied to settle in Canada, where Anh Quân's family already lived. For them, Canada offered not only a new homeland, but the comfort of kinship. Thus, destiny began to draw its lines again. The reunion of sisters, so unexpected and sweet, was also destined to be a short reunion. The months they shared on Pulau Bidong was precious but fleeting. They endured the hardships together, the storms that flooded the huts, the illnesses that spread through the camp, the endless lines of food. They comforted each other in homesickness, prayed together at night, and dreamed of the future where they might reunite once more. But as the paperwork moved forward, reality settled in. Thanh Hoa's name was tied to America, while Thanh Vân and Anh Quân paper pulled them toward Canada. The sisters knew what this meant: another separation, another farewell. When the day of parting came, it was as heartbreaking as it was inevitable. They held each other tightly, tears falling freely. The baby, too young to understand, cooed softly in his mother's arms. God had chosen our path, Thanh Hoa whispered through sobs. We must follow where he leads. The sister kissed, lingering, as if by holding on longer they might resist the tide of destiny. Then, step by step, they let go. in mid-1979 marked both reunion and farewell. On that crowded island in the middle of the sea, two sisters had found each other against all odds, only to be separated once again by the currents of history. Yet in their hearts they carry the certainty that exile could not erase blood, nor could distance break the bond of family. Waiting for tomorrow, Pulau Bidong remained the same, a place of waiting, not living. The waves still crash against its shore, boats still arrive bearing the weary, and officials still process endless names. But for Chi Thanh Hoa, something had changed. She had seen that even in exile, miracles could happen. She had touched her sister's hand, kissed her nephew's cheek, and felt the strength of the family restored. However, briefly, the island was not a paradise, but it was not despair either. It was a bridge, narrow and unstable, but leading somewhere beyond. Each day of hunger, each night of homesickness, each whispered prayer beneath the stars was part of that long crossing, and so she waited. She waited for America. She waited for the next telegram, the next letter, the next sign of family. She waited, trusting that God's hand, which had brought her sister across the sea and into her arms, would guide them on toward the futures written for them. The year was only half over. The sea had not finished its works, neither had faith. This is the end of chapter 31.